From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome to the African and Middle Eastern Division's Reading Room. My chief, Mary Jane Deebs, in the audience, also greets you to today's event. I am Marita Harper, Area Specialist in the African section of this division. Today's program is sponsored by African and Middle Eastern Division, the Asian Division, in conjunction with the Embassy of India. We will be greeted later by the Embassy of India's official, who can't be here at this point in time, Mr. Bhavender Paul, who is their Cultural Education Officer. He'll be introduced later. The African section is celebrating its 50th anniversary, and this program is part of the activities that celebrates this anniversary. Today's lecture and book signer on African elites in Africa will be discussed by Dr. Kenneth X. Robbins. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Robbins. He's a psychiatrist practicing in the Washington area and a member of the board of directors of the Friends of the Asian Division of the Library of Congress. He has a special interest in the Maharajas and has published dozens of articles on Indian history, art, religion, medicine, psychology, philately, and numismatics, and he has curated many exhibitions from his collections at sites ranging from Columbia University to the National Library of Medicine. He is currently working on a 5-volume study of the Jews of India and Jews in India. He has organized many scholarly conferences and is planning on April of 2011 a conference on South Asian Sufis to take place at St. Johns Hopkins at SAIS, the Freer Gallery, and also the Library of Congress. I give you Dr. Robbins.
Thank you very much, Marita, and appreciate this opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Deeb. I think that a lot of people are wondering whether this is going to be a very short book, like Puerto Rican Jewish hockey players in 13th century Puerto Rico. Now, a lot of people have heard that there were Indians in Africa, but nobody seems to know there were a lot of Africans in India. And the very title of the book is something that I think troubles a lot of people. People make certain assumptions that Africans can't be elites, and they certainly can't be elites anywhere outside of Africa, and they could have never ruled over non-Africans, and if there were in fact Africans who did do this, they were in fact North Africans and not East Africans from places which today are places like Somalia, Ethiopia, and so on. But this is not completely true. I was playing for you some music by a group called the City Goma, which performs African music today. And here is a 19th century painting of them, and they look quite African. And if one goes to the lower class or middle class areas of Ahmedabad and Gujarat and other places in Gujarat, this is what one finds. I actually went to see this troupe in the home where they live, and we were sitting in a little room, and the wizened matriarch of the clan, who really seemed like almost like a mummy, was all shriveled up in an almost fetal position in this tiny room. And before you know it, it was like, did you ever see that Marx Brothers movie where they all get into the ship's cabin and everybody falls out because there's so many people? And next thing you know, there's drummers and there's people playing all sorts of instruments and so on and so forth. When this wonderful experience is over, I then speak to the leader of the group, and I start to ask her questions about Africans. And it being India, only in India could this happen. The lady, of course, not only cannot answer my question, she reaches into her refrigerator. Okay, I don't know why she's reaching into her refrigerator, which of course doesn't work. And out she pulls my book. It says, if you want to know the answers, this is where you should ask. So my narcissism was very much affected by this. This is also true a few days later. We went to a dinner party, and my wife embarrassedly said, I wrote a book, and the guy said, well, what do you write a book about? She's very embarrassed, because this is a book even your mother wouldn't buy. Nobody would possibly be interested in this book. And the guy, of course, had read it. So this book has gotten much more publicity. People are much more interested than one would think in these things. Now, in Ahmedabad itself, the city has a symbol. The symbol is a mosque called the Sidi Said Mosque, which was built in the 16th century by an African. And just like the Eiffel Tower is a symbol of Paris, this wonderful stonework is the symbol of the city of Ahmedabad, one of the most recognizable symbols well known in India today, built by an African. Not the only place built by an African. So there were Africans who were in the elite. In this surrender scene of the Sultan of Gujarat to the Mughal emperor in the 16th century, in a slightly later painting, one sees two Africans clearly in the elite surrendering. And there were many such Africans. There are all sorts of legends about Africans. In this epic about the Prophet Muhammad's uncle, there are legendary Africans called the Zangis. And here are the Zangis. You can see the king of the Zangis and all of his minions. And they're wearing these curious fur hats, most of which are red. And I'm going to show you similar hats because that became the symbol in India of Africans. If you see somebody wearing such a hat, you'd know they're an African. So, well, these people were really Africans or, dark, a lot of dark people and skinned people in India. I was shocked when I went to a 13th century temple in Orissa, which is in northeast India. And up on the wall, there were two guys in front of the king with a giraffe in Middle Eastern dress, giving him a giraffe. And this is 13th century sculpture. A little bit later, in the 17th century, a zebra was presented at the Mughal court. And of course, everybody thought the stripes had been painted on. They thought this was the weirdest thing they had ever seen. Well, so I found a few people. So what? This is obviously an oddball thing, or a much later thing. Not true, because if you go and you speak to numismatists and see the coin hoards, one finds 5th century Aksumite Ethiopian coins buried all over South India. That means there was trade between India and Africa at that time. By the 8th century, India was an important market for slaves from the east coast of Africa. And the estimates that I've seen range from 4.7 to 11 million people were sold into slavery and then went to Arabia, Persia, and South Asia. A lot of people were coming and going. Much of the slave trade was in the hands of Arab merchants, and many of these were sent directly to India, into a small town, which is now a suburb of Bombay. Bombay didn't exist at the time, which was an entrepot for slaves. It's called Thane, and we have a lot of information about the slave trade there. But most of them came by way of Arabia and the Persian Gulf, and many of them entered into the areas which are now Pakistan. I said there were all these things about legendary Africans who didn't exist. This is a painting of Alexander the Great. Tales about Alexander the Great. Not historical tales, but made-up tales. In a similar manuscript, they have him defeating the Tsarist army. So I don't think that actually happened. But they're colored blue, and very often in India, blue and black are interchangeable. And you see gods, who supposedly are dark or black, and they're actually painted blue. And this was painted by a sultan in Bengal, which is northeast India, where the area where Calcutta now exists. Calcutta did not exist at this time. It's much earlier. And his father had deposed a Habshi dynasty. So from 1486 to 1493, Bengal, of all places, which had no Africans, was ruled by an African series of 4 African sultans. We have the coins to show this. Many of these Africans were involved in with other Muslims in military service. And this is a painting. I will show you a little bit because it's a little bit risque. But this was the cover of the book, a painting from my collection. And you can see this fellow is clearly an African, again, wearing this red hat. And sometimes the hat gets much more refined, as you can see in this 1570 painting with the red hat with the yellow. And in this painting, with the guy in the center in the striped uniform, costume is, in fact, an African. And he's surrounded by all sorts of other Europeans and so on and so forth. And this is all the people of the world showing their obeisance to the Mughal emperor at his enthronement. I also found in the wall paintings there were Africans, and this is a painting of, you'll see, African. And what's interesting is there are even darker people in these paintings who are not Africans. But some of these people are clearly Africans. Anybody interested in African music can tell you that this is not a glockenspiel. This is, in fact, a clearly African instrument. This is a 17th century painting. And there are all sorts of stereotypes about Africans. If you have a patent medicine today, who would give you that strength? Of course, an African with a spear. And nobody has any, feels it's politically incorrect to show this kind of thing. I said this painting was a little bit risque, and here's the whole painting. I'll pass over it quickly because it involves sex and drug taking. Those who can show me notes from their mother that they're old enough can see the painting later. A lot of Africans were in stereotyped positions. I'm still not talking about great elites. I'm talking about Africans in an elite. But a guy who cleans the White House is not the president of the United States just because he's in the White House. And these were not people who necessarily were at extremely high status, though many of them did get, even eunuchs get to high status. Here's some more eunuchs in a court scene. What's really shocking is that in a place called Mandu, which has wonderful architecture, ruins are seen, there was actually a whole core of African women in the harem. And you can see which are the Africans by which are shown three-quarter face and are darker from the woman who's shown, whose face is shown in profile, who is a dark-skinned Indian. Even in the 19th century, odd Africans turn out to become queens in bizarre manners. In one case, a very important ruler is reduced in rank by the British from the grandiose title of the Nawab Nizam of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, 3 huge states, to the Nawab of Murshidabad, a much smaller area. And he's succeeded by his son by an Abyssinian concubine. The last Sikh Maharaja was deposed as a child by the British. When he became a Christian, and he was looking for a good Christian wife, stopped in Egypt, and he married the daughter of an Abyssinian slave and a German banker. So it brings her back with his friend Queen Victoria, to hobnob with Queen Victoria. But these are still oddball things. Africans had higher positions. There were many Africans who were involved in important Islamic tasks, both in Orthodox circles and among the Sufis. Now, this is a shrine to an African saint. And many of these Sufi shrines have very strange things because you see what looks like a tomb. It's supposed to be like a tomb, and everybody goes and prays here as if his body is there. But there may be 100 or 200 shrines all over the country that show similar things. And these are Africans, children, who are playing in a shrine in their neighborhood to an African saint, Sufi saint. Now, what's interesting to me is that this African saint did not come as a slave. He came as a trader. He, in fact, started and cornered the agate trade between the Middle East and Africa on one end and India. And he and his sister became installed as Sufi saints. And the drummers that you saw and the music that you heard were adherents of this Sufi saint. He wasn't the only African who came as a trader. We know that in the 17th century, one of the most prominent commercial families was called Al-Entebbe and came from what is present-day Uganda. So if we just look, we find these things. What's even stranger is in the 15th century, Africans captured an island fort, and they did it in a strange way. They pretended to be merchants, got into boxes, and got, quote, shipwrecked on the island, and of course got everybody drunk, came out of the boxes, and took over the island. What was interesting to me here is that nobody thought it was any way strange that a bunch of Africans are coming along and claiming to be merchants. If this had happened in Savannah, Georgia in the 19th century, I assure you, it would not be seen as normal. So obviously, there were opportunities for advancement for Africans in India that there were not in other places. I said they were also involved among the leading Islamic scholars. I was looking at a very famous two-sided painting, and here's the Emperor Shah Jahan, the great Mughal emperor, honoring Muslim specialists in Islamic law. And I get look at the second side of the painting, and they're centered, nobody had noticed, right in the middle are two Africans. Clearly. I don't think there's any question about it. So how does this happen? If a lot of these, not all these people came as slaves, but a lot of them came as slaves, how do Africans become part of an elite? And how do they become actual rulers in many places, as I'll show you? Because it's the only place in the world where black Africans, ruled over non-Africans. In the Islamic world, there was a phenomenon called elite slavery, and we're in fact what we so-called slave dynasty. If one looks at South Asia, one sees several things about this. This thing of elite slavery is a situation where on a frontier, where established authority is weak, where there are foreign elites coming in and taking over, and within the elites there are struggles between different Muslim elements. On one side are those people who are so-called Westerners, who may be Shias or Sunni, depending on where they came from, and those people who are known as Deccanese, who are Sunnis. These are local people. And the Africans usually were not with the foreigners, they were with the local Muslim elites. The Africans themselves were in a curious situation because they weren't like household slaves necessarily, but they were treated as members of the family. They were entrusted with duties as court officials, administrators, and army commanders, and seen as loyal because they didn't have any outside traditional authority, though in some cases they formed factions and were able to take over power themselves. They were often at the center of factional court disputes, and I'm going to show you some of the examples where they took power themselves. But let me first tell you about some of their accomplishments. I showed you this great, beautiful stonework. To me, the most beautiful stonework I've seen anywhere. This picture does not do the delicacy of this. And I have to describe where this is. This mosque is in the middle of what's now a traffic island. And across the street is a huge block which has one house on it, which is now a hotel, which was a textile magnate's house. So all these things are going around and around, and there are these wonderful stone latticework windows in what looks like a subway kiosk. But when you get close, you see the beauty of these things. It's very impressive. Now, if there's a question about who built this so-called Sidi Said Mosque, it was built, according to the inscription, by an Abyssinian in the service of a governor. Later, he joined the personal retinue of a famous Abyssinian general in the army of the last Sultan of Gujarat, and he was a learned man, and he died in 1576. Obviously, this was no low-class person. This was obviously a person who was a rich member of the elite. So you say there's one such guy, and I mentioned another guy who was a general, but there are others. One of the most fabulous experiences I ever had in India was going to another mosque that was built by an African, the Sidi Bashir Mosque, and what the main thing that is left are the minarets, these towers. And this is the only place in the world, and we have a chapter about it in the book, how this is possible, and I've had the experience myself, where if you shake one minaret, the other minaret shakes. It's an extraordinary experience. In a sultanate called Bijapur, Africans were very important, and they built many important buildings. One of them was a fellow named Malik Sandal, and this is part of a place that he built in Bijapur. And he built this tomb and mosque for the Sultan, which are very famous in India. But I think the most extraordinary thing is the insides of the Jami Masjid in Bijapur, created by another African who also had his own mosque in his own name. But I think this is just an incredibly beautiful Marab. Africans were heavily involved in the army, as can be seen in this picture of an African included. And in this painting from my collection, here they are marching. There are 4 Africans in the lower right hand, and there's an African in the center. But in this place, which is in extreme northwest India near Pakistan, Africans played a big role in the society, were prime ministers and so on and so forth. Well, this painting doesn't show it, and I show it because it's my painting. You find Africans in other armies. In fact, in the 19th century, one of the nobles had an army in a place called near Hyderabad, and they were all Africans, and the ruler liked it so much he took over the whole thing, and they became his African bodyguard. Now I'm going to show you a picture of an army that doesn't have any Africans in it. You know why I'm showing you this picture? Because the king was an African. There were no Africans in his army. And here are 2 stamps from my collection. You'll see there's an orange one and there's a similar one in purple from a place called Sachin, which is near Surat in current-day Gujarat, that was ruled by Africans from the late 18th century to the time of independence. So when I start to make a list of this thing, here is an incomplete list of what I found. What places were ruled by Africans? Well, the first one that I came across was a place where the first sultan was a eunuch, and some people think he was an African. Couldn't prove it one way or another. Then when he died, his position was taken over by another group from Delhi, and other people think that they were Africans. I did find out, of course, that the major figure, holy figure in that thing, Muslim figure in that thing, was in fact a Syrian Jew who had converted to Islam. This is in the 14th century. So people were coming back and forth from as far as Aleppo and Africa, even in the 14th century. Vasco da Gama did not discover India. There were people here before Columbus came. The most extraordinary thing were the Habshi Sultanates of Bengal, who ruled only for 7 years, and there were 4 of them, who came as an army and took over Bengal. Then there was Sidi Masood, who was prime minister and master of the palace of Bijapur and formed a small rump state of his own. And then there were the Nawabs of Janjir and Sachin, who ruled for a long time princely states and who played a big role in this book, as I'll show you. Even bigger places like the Deccan Sultanates, and I've mentioned 4 of them here, from the 14th century to the 17th century, had strong African presences where the Africans were very often the rulers, even though they were not the rulers in name. And on and on and on. This is just a partial list. So this is not a one-off phenomenon. I mentioned the Habshi, or African Sultanates of Bengal. Here's a wonderful gold coin by one of them. And Habshi means African. I'm not going to bore you with the history of all these places, but I want to just quickly go down to mention some of the features of this. In the Bahmani Sultanate, which was from 1347 on, the One of the sultans was assassinated by his African bodyguards. In the next reign, there was a general, 2 provincial governors, and the keeper of the seals. Then Africans, with the next sultanate, were heavily involved in the power struggle, and we'd have the names of many of these Africans, and on and on and on. And when this dynasty split into several pieces, one of their local governors was an African who almost established a successor state. And this whole area, which is in central India, you can see Goa in the lower left, was split into these 5 sultanates, all of which had strong African presences. I'm not going to give you all the details of these things, but I think you get the idea from the list of all these things, and there will not be a test on all this, that Africans were involved in the power struggles and were prime ministers and so on and so forth. The most important of which was a fellow named Malik Ambar. Now, in the book, we trace Malik Ambar's back to the Kambata region of Ethiopia, where he came as a slave. And he went from slave, oh, by the way, he was a slave of a fellow who was a slave, an African slave, but was also prime minister. He went from this position to being the most feared enemy of the Mughal emperors. And the Mughal emperor was obsessed with this guy, absolutely obsessed with him, called him all sorts of racist names. The reason he has an owl on his head is because in India, an owl is a stupid bird rather than a smart bird. And this is his dream of killing his great enemy, this African. Never was able to get him. This African perfected guerrilla warfare, and the demise of the Mughal empire was by Hindus in particular, who served as his generals. So in today's politics, where you see nationalist politics, which are seen in terms of Hindu-Muslim issues, Shivaji is seen as the great, he's a Hindu, leader of the Hindus who perfected this guerrilla warfare. He served under Bijapur rulers, where an African, Ilkus Khan, was really in charge of everything. His uncle, his grandfather, his father, all served under Africans in these sultanates. These is a map of the books of the waterworks that he created in the state, which are example of the most advanced waterworks in India in his time in the early 17th century. This is his tomb, and this is his son. His son, of course, took over. And the whole thing was really thing. Malik Ambar had married his daughter to the Sultan. The next Sultan's sister may have been the wife of Malik Ambar's son, and so on and so forth. And everybody is getting killed, and the Africans turn out to win in the end. Even though they're on the wrong side, they get pensions and they win. In the next Sultanate, Bijapur, we're left with this fabulous set of paintings of one of the prime ministers, Ilkus Khan. Here he is with the Sultan, and he is, of course, the one who really holds the power. Now, I like these sultans very much because they were interested in art, and I love art. But they didn't do any of the work, and none of their paintings show any battles because they didn't fight in any battles. And I made a list here of some of the other important Africans there, as you can see in the lower left-hand corner. And it's amazing when you start to look at the history of this. In 1580 to 1627, the Sultan was this great, considered himself the master guru and the master artist. And he did these wonderful poetry, books about music, and so on and so forth. Great Persian influence. Of course, I love him. He didn't do anything politically. And an African party under Abyssinian party under two Africans, Dilawar Khan and Ilkus Khan, whose pictures I showed you, really ran the country. Ilkus Khan continued to run the country under the next Sultan. And there were a whole set of other wazirs or prime ministers who were Africans. They're all named in the book. And again, there won't be a test on this. One of those African prime ministers developed his own personal state and was later conquered by the Mughals. And again, the interest in this comes about in different ways. He was a great patron of paintings, of Muslim-style paintings, and his paintings and painters were taken away to far-off Rajasthan, to the desert in Bikaner, and the whole school of Bikaner painting and Rajasthani painting flows out of those painters. We don't really understand the percentage of them that came from his atelier and the others that came from another Muslim court. I wanted to end up by telling you about two other princely states, because these are places that I'm closely connected. One is near Bombay, and you see the Africans dressed in their Arabic dress, the ship, and they were great admirals and great sailors. And this is their impregnable island fort. And one comes up to it on Dhow. There was a whole city in here, and which has only in the 20th century been deserted. It's now in the archaeological survey. It has wonderful mosques, it has wonderful towns, and so on and so forth. And then you come up on a dhow with other tourists, other Indian tourists, because no Western tourists ever go to this place. And you've got to jump out quickly. You can see what it's like. There's this little entrance, there's stairs in this entrance, and unless you jump out of the boat quickly, you're going to be jumping into the wall. So you got to jump right into the water. So you got to picture me, I'm leading a group, and I'm not too swift. And I got with me an 88-year-old guy with two canes, and a 78-year-old guy, and we're trying to maneuver these people and get them out of the boat before we crash into the wall, but we do. And there are wonderful, carvings all over the walls. This is a map that I found that the strongest navy in the area had tried to attack this fort over generations, over 30 times. I think it was 36 times or 37 times. Never was impregnable. But this is the one thing I liked the most. This was the secret escape exit from the fort. I felt like Errol Flynn when I found this thing. So where did the rulers live as times changed and things became more safe? They built a palace on land 100 years ago, 110 years ago. And this is the palace. And here is one of the Africans. Now, I think this painting is particularly interesting because one of these Africans was married to a non-African, one of these African kings, was married to, actually the father of this boy, was married to a non-African Shiite whose father was the president of the Indian National Congress, the Freedom Movement. And her sister, in other words, the queen's sister, married a local man from that area named Faizi Rahman, who was a great painter, later became the favorite painter and close friend of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And there are a couple of things that are very strange about this whole situation. This Muslim, Faizi Rahman, was in fact born a Jew, a local indigenous Jew, and he came from this place. As a matter of fact, the Africans were ruling over this place, and there were more indigenous Jews than there were Africans in this place. I don't think you can find a history like that anywhere else in the world. And here's the present men who would be Nawab's three sisters today with their families. The woman in the lower right-hand corner is a historian, the Nawab's niece, and she wrote part of the chapters about this. And as you can see, they intermarried with other Muslims. The man in the left is not an African. His wife is right next to him, and she's lighter than him. You know, you talk about the color, and what does color mean? She's an African, and he's not. In the 18th century, the family had a dispute, and they were also admirals and chief admirals of the Mughal Navy, and controlled the whole western coast. and they formed another state in 1791. Here's one of the rulers of that state. And here's a guy who was ruling about 1930, very handsome. And the only thing that we took out of this, I don't know, it's being recorded, but I think I could say it anyway, that we took out was that he is was the father of two famous movie stars by his lovers. Here's his coronation. I think what I've shown you today is that Africans, black Africans from East Africa, did rule over non-Africans in many places in India, or hold power in places where they didn't actually hold the title. I hope that this will accomplish two things. Relationships between indigenous Africans and Indians in Africa have not always been good, and I feel that it's very important for Africans to see that they were able to accomplish things in India and were given opportunities too over other Indians. And I think that we need to put to rest the idea that we should be shocked to hear that Africans had accomplishments. If given an opportunity, Africans can do a lot of different things. I want to thank you, and I'd like to just take a few words from the Indian Embassy, from Verinda Paul, the Minister for Culture and Press, and then open up discussion to questions. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Robbins, and I would like to thank the organizers in the library to organize this event, which the embassy is very happy to co-associate with. I would like to congratulate Ken. He is one of the scholars whom I met soon after my arrival in DC about 2 months ago, and it was a great pleasure meeting him and hearing from him his areas of research. And today you have seen for yourself, how deep his research is and how meaningful conclusions he has drawn out from his work. For us, it's very important to be associated with scholars like Dr. Robbins and to encourage and be associated with this research, because it opens up new insights and new areas of cooperation. For instance, in this particular work of scholarship, in that context, I would like to say that India's relations with Africa, they are civilizational. They have been historical, very mutually beneficial and substantive civilizational linkages, and even in present times, the relations with India's relations with Africa have been developing very rapidly. I'm not a historian, but sitting through his talk, I think it was extremely incisive, and the depth of your research is really impressive. So I congratulate you on your work, and I promise, I won't stand in the way for a very interesting discussion that we are going to have now. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. Are there any questions or comments in the back?
Thank you for that very scholarly discussion. Would you address a couple things? I understood you say that Alexander the Great never really defeated his enemies. If that's true, why was there a painting commemorating?
Oh, I misspoke then. There was another painting of defeating the Tsar of Russia's armies, and I don't think that ever happened.
Why would someone commemorate a non-existent conflict?
Because I think in many times you see things that are out of, they're legends, and they don't have any concept of time. They mix all sorts of people from different centuries together.
Another issue is, was it unique for bodyguards to do something so bold as to assassinate itself? Is that very unusual in historical times?
No, because these were new states, and one of the questions that you have in a place like India is that you have areas that were not ruled over by the indigenous population, majority of the population, and it was not unusual for foreigners to come in and take over.
The Mamluks, for
Yes,
example,
sure.
in Egypt, who are slaves and take over power. And, they're also a group from outside who are slaves and take over power and rule. So the concept of having slaves come in and take over power and rule exists in different people.
Yeah, there was a slave dynasty among that ruled Delhi at one point, but I think that the question these people had to establish genealogies, and many times they would establish genealogies. Like, for example, one of the dynasties in Bahawalpur, which is now in Pakistan, claims that they're descended from the Abbasids of Egypt. In fact, at one point, the guy renamed his capital Baghdad. Yeah, so that there was this constant thing where people were taking over different places. Ma'am?
Yes, now you've got these African rulers, but have you seen evidence of their impact, for instance, in the cuisine, the food, and these structures that you're demonstrating here? Is there any kind of African influence that shows where they come from?
No, because I think that they were trying to. There's a split between what I showed you first, which is not elite, it never was elite, where the African influence is continuous, and those who have acclimated themselves as individuals to an Islamic or Islamicate setting, where that would be the lingua franca rather than some sort of African.
And what's the present day status of these people from an economic perspective?
Now you're going to get me into trouble, reopen a whole thing. There was a whole conference at the Max Planck Institute, which I fortunately didn't go, where it got down to the whole question about, was I in fact overstating this case and not really dealing with the fact that there were a number of poor African groups today, and those are the majority of people who never had any relationship to these things in power. And they have different backgrounds. Most of them are Muslim or some sort of Sufi in the north. In the south, in Karnataka, there are some that are Hindu and Christian. But these are depressed groups, basically. And they're finding their voices. And the question of how they're finding their voices is, will they be seen as separate groups, or will they become part of Islamic groups? In other words, will their ethnic background be less important than the fact that they're Muslim? And so the Sufi shrines are changing. And for example, in the Sufi shrines in Gujarat, they're becoming much more Islamic, normative Islamic. And I'm told, I'm not sure, that the local Africans have no longer really have control of that, one of those shrines.
And I wanted also to add Habshi is Habash in Arabic, which means Ethiopia. So the Habshi is linked to Africa, but also more specific to Ethiopia. So you can see the linkage to specific areas in Africa.
Yeah. I think it's a very good point, but because an Ethiopian researcher at the Max Planck Institute actually went to Hyderabad, where the population there were Africans there for hundreds and hundreds of years, but there was a new influx in the 19th century, and he was able to find Somali clan names. So he was able to take that a step further that I couldn't. Sir?
I would just say the connections, I think, to like the Arabian Sea and so forth, are long and very, very deep. That first slide, that very first word, as James was pointed out, Habshi, as soon as I saw it, was obviously Habsha.
Yes.
So the Egyptians call themselves, they have this thing about singing showing up that you can see how that's survived and so forth. That's not a term that the Ethiopians use. That's something from outside. But I was also interested in the term, was it Zanjis?
Yeah.
Well, Tanzania is what the Arabs call East African coast.
Absolutely.
Some of it quite just collided into Tanzania and Zanji.
And
Yeah.
exist again under Iraq and
But when they're dealing with these, they're not dealing with historical facts. They're dealing with stories from the Iskandar stories of Alexander the Great, or story of Hamza, the prophet's uncle. Not actual factual ones, and that distinction is made. But I think you're right. I think that is the basis of it. Sir?
Would you agree with me that these Africans who are ruling in India, they did not have colonizing attitude? If you compare, let's say, with the Europeans who went to Australia or Canada or came here, or even went to South Africa, or even Kenya, the Europeans were colonized wherever they went. But these Africans in India, I can say that they conducted themselves more or less like African chiefs, but they did not have the attitude of colonizing large.
In other words, they didn't send a ship back to bring people from Ethiopia to join them and colonize the area. I think that's absolutely true.
Or even to open up large agricultural plantations. They didn't do that.
No, I think that their identity was always in. I just came from Lucknow, and in Lucknow, there's the so-called depressed classes, what most people in America call the untouchables, have a new heroine who was a dead shot in this mutiny in 1857, 1858. And the leading researcher on Lucknow has turned up the fact that she was in fact an African. She wasn't an untouchable at all, and her identity was taken away from her, and has located a whole series of Africans who came in the 18th and 19th century to that court. And she found the remnants of these people still separated out, but now living in very depressed conditions because that court life disappeared 150 years ago. But I don't think there was any attempt ever by Africans to colonize in Janjira, which ruled over 100,000 people. The African population was never more than 200, 250, and they were intermarrying with other Muslims. They just were a small elite. Sir? Huh. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Robbins, for a very insightful and very informative lecture on Africans in India. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And at this point in time, I would like for those of you who went to get a book signed, there are books in the back for you to purchase, and Dr. Robbins will be glad to sign the books for you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.